When we sit down, it's time for the conversation. Joining me in studio, Yvonne Mainge and Sylvester Makaka. Thank you very much for making time. Before the break, I was just laying into context everything that's happening. And there is a global conversation right now about climate change. And it's so strong that we're even seeing leaders beginning to take action, young kids getting into the conversation. However, one can't help but wonder, what is the place of Africa in that conversation, and even Kenya? Why should we be active and at the forefront of this climate change conversation? Let's start with you, Yvonne.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts. I think Africa is at such a unique position, and we're placed in a very interesting space right now, and on two fronts. One is on the adaptation front. So when you think about climate change, you're not just thinking about what is causing, us to experience these impacts. You're also thinking about how we're going to deal with these impacts. And that is a very crucial conversation for Africa, because we might be the least polluters, we might be the least contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, but we are the hardest hit. We are the most vulnerable when it comes to experiencing the impacts of climate change. When you think about droughts, when you think about floods, when you think about sea level rise, when you think about the economic impact that these environmental disasters are going to have on the continent, Africa is also, we are a continent that is also experiencing widespread poverty. So what climate change does is it exacerbates these challenges that we're already experiencing. And so on the adaptation front, Africa is uniquely placed because we have to adapt. We don't have a choice. We are experiencing these impacts, and we are going to be the hardest hit, whether we like it or we don't. And so we have to think about, how do we adapt to these impacts of climate change that we're experiencing?
So first, I'd like to pick your thoughts on that.
Africa is, in my view, in a very interesting position on the global map. One, that the population of Africa has crossed 1 billion. China crossed 1 billion some 10 years or so behind. India crossed, which means we are actually at the springboard to industrialization. 1 billion market in Africa is a springboard for industrialization. Now, the question Africa should be asking itself is, shall we follow the same growth trajectory India, Asia, Europe, America had, or we want to be different? And if we want to be different, then what should we then be taking as our position on how to industrialize? Shall we be polluting? Shall our pollution be in tandem with our growth, or our trajectory will be different? That's the question Africa must ask itself.
What trajectory do we take, Yvonne? Because he's raised a very vital point. 1.2 billion, we're supposed to be 1.5 by 2030. There was the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which means it's a single market, a big market. So this means trade is coming up, industries are coming up, manufacturing is going to grow. What trajectory do we take moving forward?
I think we have a great opportunity. Africa has an opportunity to not just do things differently, but to take the lead. Right? We have an opportunity, because we are at such a critical part of our development. We have the opportunity to rethink how we do development. We have the opportunity to innovate and move past some of the more problematic modes of development that have been focused on by developing countries. We have the opportunity to focus on green energy, on renewables. We have the opportunity to integrate mainstreaming of climate change into every single decision making that we're doing. And I think in that way, the trajectory that Africa has and the way that we can think through our development is completely different. And that's where I think that the strength of Africa comes in. And we also have the biggest youthful population as well. So, majority of our population of Africa are actually under the age of 30. So how do we engage them? How do we push them towards a different mode of thinking, push them towards focusing on renewables, focusing on green energy, focusing on making the right decisions that are not going to push us further into a climate crisis.
Before I come to you, Sylvester, we will be playing a short video by Eliane Wanjiku just briefly in about 30 seconds. However, she's young and she's advocating for good climate decisions just to combat climate change further. But right about now, Sylvester, I would like to know, because you come from a sector where you're at the forefront of industrial revolution.
Exactly. What
adaptations, particularly in the Kenyan context, could we make as of now?
You know, we as manufacturers, manufacturing is touches everybody's life. And by touching everybody's life, it means it's with you when you wake up and it's with you when you sleep. And that means the carbon footprint is actually distributed across the population. So the manufacturing fraternity is looking at how then do we play our role, one, in what we call the life cycle accounting. Up to what stage is my responsibility as a manufacturer? If I gave you, say, a bottle of water, what is the carbon footprint on that? And so that once we have this data, and we have credible data that we can use to project our growth going forward, then it means we have a way, or we are halfway to the solution. So I think as manufacturing, we are looking at that full cycle ownership, so that we understand what is the footprint on every product that we roll out in our market. Number two, there is a whole campaign around manufacturing, although they call it under the CSR or CSI, but there is a whole campaign around greening and cleaning the manufacturing. And greening means, in our small way, we need to do some bit of tree planting, so that we can harvest the little CO2 or the much CO2 that is being emitted into the environment and reduce the impact. On adaptation, I think we are well spread across the country, and wherever we are, the footprint must be felt in the sense that we are part of the community development programs, the community climate change programs. And you've seen a lot of campaigns on media around the green economy. And green economy is actually, we have an obligation to government to report under the Climate Change Action Plan, to report on our emission levels. And that means that whatever we do, it should be within the system. So the system must set objectives and targets for what we need to achieve.
Very briefly, how do our emission levels look like in the Kenyan context? Because it's being said emissions on the global context in the last 20 years has risen by over 4%.
Kenya becomes a very interesting country to discuss, because one, our energy mix, if you look at the recent figures, we are looking at 90% being renewable. So less than 10% is from the polluting factors. And that means our carbon footprint on energy is way less. So we're not very bad, but that doesn't mean that we stop. It means we can go neutral. We are not yet neutral, yes.
Yeah. Yvonne?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with what Sylvester is saying. And if you look at Africa as a whole, I think we contribute 4 or 5% to global, carbon emissions, which is it's incredibly low when you think about on a global front what the other countries are doing. But I'm very much about opportunity and how we can think through that, because what Sylvester is saying, particularly around the manufacturers, is there is a great chance to really capitalize on the green economy. But more so because you have to show manufacturers that it makes business sense for you to think through climate change and how that impacts your business. Because, for example, a manufacturer who's producing beer, where they get their raw material, they need to be very careful with how they're dealing with their farmers, because now farmers are experiencing drought. They're experiencing, differences and changes in variables that are consistent with climate change. So you're not getting enough rainfall, you're getting too much rainfall. So if they're not working with their farmers and helping them to adapt to those impacts, their raw material, which affects their supply chain, is going to be affected. And so that beer maker, it's in his good right, and it makes business sense for him to think through his supply chain and think through each level and how climate change is impacting that. And he's also raised a good point about the National Climate Change Action Plan and the requirements that it's now putting on manufacturers. So it means that manufacturers can't can't just go ahead and emit as they'd like. They have to think through their carbon emissions. They have to report on that, and they will be held accountable on that.
Let me just add on that the catchword here is sustainability. And sustainability, the big question that comes is, am I sustaining my raw material source? Am I sustaining my market as consumers? Or am I sustaining my business, which means I just want to make profit? Or am I sustaining the whole value chain? And when we look at it as manufacturers, and that's why our interest goes beyond the factory gate, is looking at the sustainability of the ecosystem, the whole value chain.
Okay.
So if I want to take a Tusker, or I want to sell a Tusker to the market, and I'm just using Tusker for discussion, what goes into this Tusker, and how do I ensure that it will be there beyond tomorrow?
Okay.
Yes, and
Good
that is the essence of sustainable development. Yes.
Now, the last 2 or 3 weeks, every Friday, which is tomorrow, we've been seeing school strikes and global marches inspired by Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old Swedish girl who, excuse me, began the school strike just as one person, but now the global fire has caught pace, and every single place of the world, these marches are being held. And the interesting thing is that this conversation is now being driven by very young people who are saying, we need to live in a safe world, in a clean world with good resources. You need to take care of the planet for our sake. And also in Kenya, you're not left behind. Eliane has been at the forefront of this conversation. Recently, she spoke at the WWF, and this is what she had to say. Listening.
The youth around the world are ready to get hands dirty and work with you. We are full of bright ideas, full of energy. We are digital too. During the Greening Kenya launch by Dr. Fred Matiang'i, they set a target of 50 million trees planted by 2020. If they targeted 3 trees per student and every youth below, 35 was given the seedlings and shown where to plant. This target would be achieved in 3 days. Just do the maths. It's not rocket science.
Just do the math. It's not rocket science. How do we bring in the Kenyan youth into this conversation, and so that they can have a place at the table and help combat climate change? Yvonne?
I mean, I think she's a great example. The Kenyan youth are at the forefront of this conversation. I think, you know, Greta has done an amazing job of really bringing media attention and putting this issue of youth-driven power on climate change and action on climate change. She's really brought it to the forefront of our agenda. But, you know, it is the young people who've been pushing this agenda for decades. You know, because at the end of the day, young people are the ones who are going to inherit, you know, in the next 10, 20 years. And all these problems that we're experiencing now are going to be scaled up. And young people are the ones who are going to inherit this planet with all of this magnitude of issues. I think if you look at, you know, the work of organizations like Save Lamu, I've worked very closely with them. And if you look at...
Or the coal plant?
Yes. So the work that they're doing in Lamu to ensure that it does remain carbon neutral, that they do decolonize and not go in that direction. These are all powered by young people. If you look at the work of even the Greenbelt movement and the young people that they've engaged, it is truly the young people who've been pushing this agenda. But you know, at the same time, I do think it's very sad. I think that it is sad that a 16-year-old has to step out of school and not show up to school to get, you know, the leader's attention. And what she's saying is absolutely true, and exactly what she said as well. Listen to the science. We're not asking you to reinvent the wheel. We're not asking you to do anything different. We're asking you to listen to the science and to integrate and implement that in your governance decisions. That's it.
Will this global youth force translate into political action?
Good question. A good question, and every time you try to mix politics and science, you get a conflict of ideas. But I think the young of the world needs to be told what they require to survive. Whether they require a tree or 10 trees. And then if these trees can keep them alive for the 70, 80 years they'll be around, they'll definitely be transferring that knowledge and understanding to their next generation. And they need to be empowered with data. And that data should be projecting to the future, that for them to survive, they'll have to do A, B, C, D, so that we set them on a path for their survival. As of now, and that's why I'm saying if you put politics, they'll be viewed as complainants because they are using data that has maybe is well behind them. They need to know what is going to happen in the future and what do they require.
Science has already projected that even if we do everything we can in the next 15 years, the global temperatures will still be up by 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Exactly.
But and anything beyond 1.5 degrees
but
Celsius.
What do I need to do as an individual? It's not clear to me yet, at least at the young level. They still want to go into manufacturing, they still want to go into, they really don't want to address now the issue of climate change because it is something that is on the global scene already and we can talk about it.
Yvonne?
I mean, you asked whether it would translate into political action, and I think, you know, political action is one front, and that's also a front that is proving to be the most complicated and the most difficult when it comes to climate action. I think you need to think about how youth are empowering action on a wide level of fronts. So you look at on the private sector, for example, you know, America is a perfect example where on a governance level there is no real action on climate change, but on the private sector level you have billionaires, millionaires, people like Michael Bloomberg, who are putting aside billions of dollars to work on climate change action within the country. So what they're saying is that, listen, whether, you know, Trump wakes up and decides to implement this or not, we are going to do something. And I think that's where the power of young people has been incredibly effective, because they are pushing action on so many different fronts, which is what we require at this point in time.
Speaking of power, you mentioned before Africa emission 4 or 5%, give or take. However, we are equally suffering the consequences of climate change, just like the big industrial countries. So when we go to the seat at the table in terms of global climate change, what tone do we adopt?
I think, you know, and we've seen from negotiations leading even up to the Paris Agreement that the Africans as a whole all came together. And we're very strong as a bloc, as opposed to coming on a country level. And we're very strong in communicating exactly that. Listen, we are not responsible here, but these are the impacts that we are experiencing, and it's going to get worse. So developed countries need to make a very strong commitment towards helping developing countries figure out how to adapt to all of these different scenarios that we're experiencing. And which is why you have, like, for example, the Green Climate Fund, where developed countries are pouring money that developing countries can access and use for adaptation action. I think where the nuance has come in, the complication is that people don't want to focus too much on adaptation because then you don't talk enough about mitigation, which is really, you know, at the core of it all. You know, no matter what we do as a continent, as a country, if developed countries and developing economies like China's and Brazil's and India's do not make radical, dramatic shifts to their carbon emissions, we are going to be in a very difficult position. And that is the reality. It doesn't matter, no matter how much action we take as a continent and as a country, if these big countries do not do what they need to do, we're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Sylvester?
The impact of climate change and on Africa economies is phenomenal. 1 year drought and the whole economy is wiped out.
Kenya is a perfect example.
And that means that as much as we claim a low number of emission, we cannot sit pretty and say the polluters should do something. I think we must recognize the fact that this is an ecosystem that affects you, me, and everybody else around the world the same way, with various impacts. So we got to rethink as Africa and say, I think that going forward we should be looking at leapfrogging those we have so far called the heavy polluters. We should be leapfrogging them and show them the way. Now, this is where we come in, and showing them the way, it means that we have a solution that they don't have. Then they'll come running and help us either pouring in money to help mitigate or pouring in money to help adapt to climate change, but we need to leapfrog so that we don't follow the same footsteps.
Before we get to the point on funds,
yes.
You've just spoken about pollution. You come from the Kenya Association of Manufacturers,
yes.
And there have been conversations here and there, one about pollution, two about recycling. What's the position of the association in terms of cutting down their waste in the interest of climate?
Precisely, that's a very interesting question, and I'll try to answer or respond to it in a wider perspective.
In an honest way.
A very honest way. One is that the manufacturing fraternity in Kenya has adopted two critical policies or more. Mm-hmm. At least I'll talk about two. One is that on energy front, mm-hmm. apart from being the advocates for cleaner and greener energy, we are also advocating for efficiency in the manufacturing processes. And by efficiency, we're looking at where were we in the 70s when industrialization kicked in, and where are we now, and how do we then move forward? Mm-hmm. What technologies are actually better placed to give us better efficiency, and by so doing addressing our competitiveness. Then we are looking at the whole issue of waste, and waste is big because even our water from mm-hmm. our processes is discharged to streams, mm-hmm. and if you run around Nairobi River, everybody will say is the industry that is polluting. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at ways and means of actually cleaning the water before we discharge it. And I know NEMA is very strong on this, and it's policing or monitoring on a year-on-year basis mm-hmm. to see what are we doing, so that we manage at least the disposables from the industry back to the environment in a way that, but finally, we are looking at our resources. Mm-hmm. This country is endowed with resources, but you will be surprised that we import quite a lot of resources from elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And that means then we are taking out a lot of money in foreign exchange to bring in raw materials. Mm-hmm. So we are looking at how we can circularize the manufacturing, so that a waste, say in Dandora, may be a raw material in Nakuru. Mm-hmm. And we are looking at that as a policy.
Okay. Now, we're almost coming to a close of this conversation,
yes.
but I want us to talk about solutions moving forward.
Yes.
One, the Global Climate Fund, Kitty, only has 2% of allocations. What more do we need to do in terms of allocating funds to climate change so that we ensure that we are combating climate change the right way, and moving forward we have enough funds to mitigate and to help adapt?
I think for Kenya, Kenya was one of those very unique countries in Africa where we have a climate change act rather. Mm-hmm. Kenya and Nigeria are the only countries in Africa that have passed legislation on climate change, which I think is quite noteworthy when you think about it. But when you look at the Climate Change Act and the provisions, there is a need for us to think about this on a county level.
Yes.
And think about how are we actually implementing the Climate Change Act on a county level. How are we distributing funds from national into the counties, and how are counties themselves allocating funds for them to be able to do work on climate change? Mm-hmm. So if you look at counties like Kitui and Makueni, and now Isiolo and Garissa, I believe, they have taken a leadership role in that, and have actually instituted county climate change funds, where they are not, they're not waiting for money from the national government. They're actually giving a percentage of their county budget towards the County Climate Change Fund, which will go towards climate change action on a county level. I think this is incredible, and counties all over the country need to be thinking about this. How are we thinking about climate change on a county level? The other thing is we also need to build capacity, because on a county level you have MCAs, you have your county executives who climate change is something they're still trying to understand, and they're not necessarily sure what is mitigation, what is adaptation, how do we, and so we need to build capacity on a county level so that these counties can be able to mainstream climate change into all of their decision making. I talk about mainstreaming a lot because I think that is the strongest and the fastest way and the most efficient way for us to get climate action really across all sectors. We need to be thinking about climate change in our water sector. We need to be thinking about climate change in our environment sector. We need to be thinking about it in our business and development. It needs to be mainstreamed across all these different sectors, and I think it is noteworthy to look at some of the counties that are doing this through their county climate change funds and to see how we can empower the other counties to do the same thing.
Agriculture remains the backbone of Kenya's economy. However, for the next 5 or 10 years, and if we do the right thing, then climate change is here, and climate change is here to stay. How do we ensure that we adapt to the changing times and trends?
I think Kenya has a very young or youthful population, and the big question would be lifting from where she talked about mainstreaming. At what point do we impart or start imparting the knowledge around climate change? I think by mainstreaming we need to start at the primary educational level, so that as you grow up from the village or from the city, you're already aware of the consequences of what you are doing or avoiding to do. And then agriculture will remain our backbone, and agriculture is not going to take a second position very soon. And that means that we need to guard everything around agriculture. And by guarding, we need to know where our rain catchment areas are and how do we protect them so that we are guarding the rain. And where are we going, or where should we then be redirecting our investments to protect our agriculture, so that the future generation can still look at Kenya and say we made the right decision in 2020 or in 2019. The government, I think the government is thinking in the right direction. And I was very happy the other day when we saw the PS Betty Maina appointed to the Ministry of Environment, because I think she was part of the think tank around the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And that means that everything that we do is integrated around climate change. And how we do it now impacts on tomorrow. So we need to go much lower and start imparting this knowledge at a younger generation, much younger at primary level, and make it part of the schooling system.
In a short while, we'll bring in a short video by the President Uhuru Kenyatta, but he has also been lauded on a global space for taking the forefront in the climate change conversation. Kenya is one of the few countries in the world that has banned plastic waste, and in just a year's time the change is immense. Like, you can't see plastic bags all over the place. We're just suffering from the residual waste that we've had over the years. But he spoke recently at the United Nations General Assembly on climate change, and this is what he had to say about climate change. Listening.
Our commitment is to tackle climate change, and this runs deep and arises out of our need to secure our future and that of our children, as we all have been victims of drought and declining rainfall, which have destroyed our livelihoods, and many lives have been lost. And all this calls on a need for increasing the requirement of public resources to address emergencies and disasters. Kenya, therefore, has joined together with other nations in affirmation of the global commitments by ratifying our agreements and further domesticating the same in our national laws and strategies to ensure that there is action at all levels of government.
Well, there you have it. Are we with the President on this?
I mean, in his sentiments, absolutely. But I think it's worth discussing that, you know, Kenya also has to, we need to figure out our inconsistencies, because we're a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, we are being lauded for, you know, taking such strong action on climate change, and we have a Climate Change Act, we have, you know, banned plastic, but at the same time, on the other side, we're promoting the use of coal, which is, you know, one of the worst decisions that we could have made, and we're also developing our oil in Turkana. So, you know, these are the paradoxical decisions that Kenya is making that we also need to discuss. They warrant a discussion. If we do want to be focused on renewables, if we want to be carbon neutral, if we want to focus on green energy, then let's do that. We need to steer away, you know, from developing coal, from developing fossil fuels, because these are the actions that are taking us backwards, in my opinion.
Profit versus people. You, the manufacturers, need energy, but we also need this planet and people so that we can buy your products.
You know, action speaks much louder than words. And by action, we mean that once we start moving in the right direction, putting in place the right policies and driving change at grassroots level, money will still flow. And the government should show direction by allocating enough resources towards the fight against climate change.
Quick question.
That should show direction
Quick
on what
question.
level of commitment.
Will we be seeing the manufacturing sector taking a stand and saying if the government develops fossil fuels, we are not buying, we'll only stick with green energy?
It might even be worse. Some may choose not to take up that energy also and say we are migrating because of our footprint. It is a possibility. People have moved from dirtier economies to go to where it's cleaner. And they have just forced China to switch more, to start investing in cleaner energy. And we have seen what has happened in China. They're investing in solar. It means, and that's what I'm saying, policies must be aligned to the need and then pool the resources so that everything works.
The thing is, if there's demand, then the government is going to develop the coal plant. The government is going to develop the the oil in Turkana.
But I think the issue is that where is the demand, right?
Yeah.
Because it's foreign companies that are setting up these energy development companies in Kenya, and it's not necessarily based on Kenyan demand, right? So, for example, the coal plant, for example, when you look at even the oil development in Turkana, it's not, doesn't belong to Kenya when you really think about it. So I think we just need to have a cohesive front, and we need to be clear in terms of our goals and in terms of the direction that we want to go as a country. If we want to be carbon neutral, if we want to really take a leadership role in terms of climate change action, what does that mean? And part of that, in my opinion, is that you do not go in the direction of anything that promotes greenhouse gas.
Will investment in green energy compensate for the investment lost in fossil fuel?
Absolutely. And you can see it all over the world right now. And you know, it's good that he raised the fact that Kenya, we are 90% dependent on renewables already. So that tells you we're doing okay. We don't need it. I think, you know, this is the complex and why climate change is such a wicked problem, because there are equity issues as well. At the end of the day, countries around the world have had time to develop their oil, to exploit it and to get all the money that they could out of it. And then now when Kenya is in the same situation, it's like, no, actually don't develop your oil because of climate change. And I think this is why climate change is such a complex problem for countries to get their head around, and for us to figure out really what action on a country level should be. But having said that, I think there's an opportunity for us to do things differently.
Your last battle?
Yes. Kenya must rethink its strategy into the industrial space and understand that the future of manufacturing will be cleaner and greener. And so everything that we do must support that future. Yeah.
Well, there you have it. The future of manufacturing is cleaner and greener. That's just the Kenyan case. What's the global case? We want to take a short breather. When we come back, Social Watch.